Guys, can you hear my voice and see the PPT?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is the other slides moving?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So, let's talk about a little bit about theories of underdevelopment. So, last in the last class we read various theories or various economic theories, and the theory that we were talking about was the neoclassical approach, basically in terms of supply and demand. And it almost appeared that the supply and demand was enough to take care of all problems in the market, in the sense that the supply and demand will inevitably create an equilibrium, jobs will be created, the capitalist model of profit making will be adhered to, and so on and so forth. We also looked at what Karl Marx was talking about, the Keynesian theory on economics. We did a little bit on the institutions also. The fact that the whole human system is consisting of institutions and language, money, law, system. So these are all the systems which come into play. And a very interesting way to figure out how these things function is the fact that besides supply and demand, you look at currently the politics that is going on. When the Trump administration declared a new set of tariffs, so inevitably, in a supply demand situation, resources started in the share market, for example, when they realized the fact that the US was becoming a difficult market to do business, money started moving out into other markets. And then we realized the fact how things started changing, especially the bond market. Now these are institutions. The share market is an institution, the bond market is an institution. So inevitably it's not just the supply and demand, there are institutions also which have a role to play in the global economics. In fact, the current situation is a very interesting situation to see. And as I have been telling, all these theories were made by economists in specific periods of time. Theories are, or economics is not a science. You cannot test it out in a lab. So inevitably, an economist would look at a situation and bring out a theory, and no theory is perfect, because inevitably in the real world there are many more things at play rather than how a theory is put up or described. So let's look at today's unit. We are looking at theories relating to underdevelopment. Now, typically, a lot of things were said in terms of development. Typically, a supply-demand situation should allow development to happen both in the developed countries and underdeveloped countries. But we will understand the fact out of this presentation that it is not as simple as supply-demand, or and how institutions play a role, and how the role of imperialism or colonization altered the very relation between nations. It's not as simple. It's not as simple as supply and demand. You can see it from your own household, or the way you do economics in the household in terms of money coming in. It's not as simple as a supply and demand. There are many other factors which come into play. So let's look at some of the theories which were formulated in terms of underdevelopment. One of the factors they said was historical factors, specifically because of the large colonization. And this theory talked about the fact that economy is structured in terms of core and periphery. And instead of a mutually beneficial exchange, countries in the periphery cater to the interest of the core. Similarly, if you look at the fact between an urban center and a rural center or rural centers, many a times either these are the rural centers which cater to the urban center. For example, all agriculture produce which is produced in the rural area comes to the urban center. What the farmer receives in terms of remuneration for his crop is nothing compared to what the people in the urban areas pay for purchase of that produce. And this is an exploitative relation where the core exploits the periphery. And we shall see how, even among nations, among regions, there is this core periphery thing, and there is a dependency scenario rather than an interdependent economic ties. So, for example, in fact, the whole what Marx talked about, the fact that the whole system, or the whole capitalist system, is a very exploitative system where the capitalists exploit the labor, and the labor's, irrespective of the supply and demand, which almost feels like a interdependent scenario, it is actually a exploitative scenario. So the theory talks about, as long as the core periphery relation goes well within the global capitalism, periphery tends to express progressive economic growth. And one of the policy prescription this theory talks about is that the periphery, the countries in the periphery, should actually opt out of the global system because they open up to exploitation. In fact, in the next unit, where we talk about trade and technology, we will see how trade and technology are also used by the global south, global north, or the developed countries to actually exploit the global south or the underdeveloped countries. Then there is the story of structuralism, consistent decline of agriculture commodity in relation to price of industrial goods. Structuralism basically talks about the fact that in the course of development, the structures change from agriculture to industry to services. Uh, Again, this talks about the center periphery structure in the world economy and surplus labor. Countries that produce more value added industrial good at from the center. Uh, uh, Countries that have been exporting agriculture constitute the periphery. So the industrial form the center, and agriculture commodities, because they are traditional economies, their structure of GDP and the structure of economy is traditional. They mostly export labor, agriculture and labor. Again, the fact is these theories can be used to craft an answer in any of the questions which come in your examination. Per se, I do not think there's going to be a question, what are the various theories of underdevelopment. There could be a question, there could be a short notes on theories of underdevelopment, but more often than not, you can use these theories or text to these theories for crafting an answer to your question. The world trade has been diverting surpluses and advantages in favor of developed countries who form the center. Persistent foreign terms trade impact employment. Producers of agriculture goods tend to reduce employment, generating a pool of surplus labor. So, inevitably, as the structure of an economy moves from agriculture to industry, there is surplus labor which gets generated. Dispatch from the agriculture sector cannot be deployed in industrial sector, since manufacturing sector is not good enough, and these labor then form in terms of a supply of labor to industrial countries where there is a high demand for labor. In fact, when you read this MDI 7 with the means of production and the changes of production in MDI 8, you realize the fact how the wages have been pushed down, and why outsourcing, contracting is more often used, because capitalism looks at profit. When initially the profit increased using the Fordist model of production line, then subsequently, as mass consumption changed into individual preferences, the capitalists could not invest so much money in individual catering to individual customers. So the only way to do it was to press wages down, and the only way to press wages down was outsourcing and contracting. Then there is a theory called the dependency theory, and if you see, most of these theories are very similar to each other. Refutes views such as stages of growth, dualism in society to explain growing gap between developed. And again, economists keep on figuring out how to, quantify labor, how to explain underdevelopment, how to, boost up GDPs of a country. And these various theories come to being. Point out how colonization brought the status of satellites to these countries that cater to the needs of metropolis regions that are developed countries. And I give similar analogy between urban centers and rural areas. So you will see inevitably rural areas have abundance of labor because of changes of agriculture, economy. These extra laborers do not find jobs in the rural areas. They cater to the core, which is the urban areas. They come out here in the urban areas. They're exploited. There are metropolises and satellites, so the structure exists in multiple scales, global to local. And there is a sort of a dependency of the rural on the urban, like there is a dependency of the peripheral countries on the core countries. And then there was the role of imperialism and development implications. So, all those theories which talked about that for a country to become developed, they have to go through the traditional route of agriculture to industry to services. India was a particular example where industry did not take off. People moved from agriculture to services. And most of the Western economies, because inevitably a lot of theories were created in the West, they looked at their own societies and their own models, try to bring out policy prescriptions for the developing world, came out with policies saying that you need to cut welfare, you need to cut subsidies so that agriculture can move into industries to services, and that's the way development happens, conveniently forgetting the fact that a lot of global north actually colonized the global south. Impact of imperialism on the development of underdevelopment. So essentially, because of imperialism, a lot of resources, a lot of capital was extracted out of the global south, and that led to the industrial revolution in the global north. Essentially, what typically happened was the global south got impoverished. Imperialism has caused irreversible cumulative disadvantage of the underdeveloped countries, which were colonized by the developed country, crippling underdeveloped country potential. Something again, an analogy between urban centers and rural areas. Look at the fact how urban centers, draw in water, electricity, impoverishing the rural areas. So inevitably, the pressure is always to provide amenities to the urban areas, leading to less of resources for the rural areas. So you can always, whenever you are trying to craft an answer, give an analogy between an urban area and a rural area. I hope I'm not going too fast, guys. Guys, I hope I'm not going too fast.
No, sir.
Okay, okay. Even after underdeveloped countries attained independence, process of underdevelopment may persist since developed and powerful countries perpetuate imperialism by relocating cheapest manufacturing. We have seen many a times that developing countries tend to get technology which is either obsolete or it is on the interest of the developed countries to push that technology. And we hear international division of labor. One of the examples of trade is, or one of the reasons or narrative for outsourcing is to provide jobs in the underdeveloped countries, the to provide tech. So all these narratives are provided, but basically this theory particularly talked about that in spite of independence, most of the global south these powerful countries perpetuate imperialism by relocating cheapest manufacturing process. And that is why each country needs to look out for its own interest rather than specific policy prescriptions which come from the north. There are salient features that are applicable to underdeveloped country: history of imperialist infiltration, low per capita income, low level economic development, internal and external problems to development from the history. So basically, this theory talks about the fact that imperialism did major damage to most of the colonized countries, irreversible damage, and now any policy prescription does not work because that imperialism still persists in the other forms of technology and international division of labor. Then there is this theory of unequal exchange. Unequal exchange also talks about economic value getting concentrated in a few. And we see that in a national economy, there is economic value getting concentrated in a few hands. Large majority does not have the wealth. In particular, neoclassical economic posits that market and free trade facilitates diffusion of wealth. So most of the policy prescription or the economic theories we have been hearing since the time India got independent was the trickle down theory, where they said that and this is a part of the neoclassical economics which says that wealth will diffuse, but we know that wealth does not diffuse. Inevitably it gets concentrated, which is called the centripetal. So don't worry about the centripetal and centrifugal process. These are physics terms. Inevitably, wealth gets concentrated, does not diffuse down, unless there is a affirmative action in trying to get wealth to diffuse. The pure economics of the process does not allow the wealth to diffuse. So that's called the theory of unequal exchange. So let's look at the interlinkages between trade, technology, and employment. Inevitably, again, the larger narrative is that trade leads to a diffusion of technology, trade leads to opening up of the market, trade leads to employment opportunities. But let's see, it is nuanced. There are multiple nuances to it. That is why I combined these two units, because inevitably the theory of unequal exchange, the theory of dependency will get you to understand that why there are nuances, and it is not straightforward that a trade will allow employment opportunities, or a trade will lead to diffusion of technology, or a trade will lead to better economic opportunities. So let's look at some basic concepts. Foreign trade, economic exchange of capital, goods, services between different nations. Free trade refers to policy framework that takes place a free exchange of goods and services between national economies. Now, we need to also understand that there is a parallel engine of politics which which is at operation. Now, for example, North America has a North America Free Trade Agreement which allows a free trade between countries of North America. But the American politics was driving or pushing the new administration to increase tariffs because the US felt that the trade terms were against its interest. Now, that's politics at play. Whether they were actually against their interest, we do not know because it's not easy to compute. But inevitably, the American politics or American politicians felt that this was a political, topic to rake up, and we see the result out of that. Free trade refers to policy framework, takes place free exchange. Like for example, NAFTA is an example of free trade. Trade openness is an indication of degree by which various national economies engage. Now, the nation has to balance between free trade and putting some tariffs. Now, more often than not, free trade, does not. For example, nation put some tariffs to protect certain industries, to protect certain, resources, because free trade is, in a capitalist system, will does not augur well for a nation's economy. Labor standards refer to international accepted standards to ensure livelihood security of workers, protecting their basic rights. Again, these labor standards have developed over a large time frame, because as a world, or as humanity understood the fact that inevitably human beings are important, human rights are important, and these labor standards are required to adhere to international human rights. Then there are organizations like ILO, which is the key agency involved in setting these standards through both conventions and recommendations. Again, understand the fact no country is bound by conventions, recommendations, or standards, but countries do follow, because at the end of the day, you are in a larger, system, and inevitably, if you do not follow certain norms of the world, then you get isolated or you stand out. So we have seen currently also, with US bringing out its tariff, it almost is standing out, and other nations are now talking to each other. So in spite of one of the biggest economies putting out tariffs because of politics, they have been isolated in a way, and they had to roll back or put a pause on their tariffs. So the earliest notions of foreign trade based on the principles of comparative advantages put by David Ricardo. Remember, David Ricardo was also the originator of the classical theory of economics, which talked about surplus. The classical theory was talking about surplus. The neoclassical talks about supply and demand. The comparative advantage nation determined by its relative endowment with factors of production. Countries should specialize in production of those goods for which production is it makes an intensive use of abundant factors. So inevitably, the classical theory of foreign trade talked about whatever are your advantages, you should typically make products out of whatever advantages you have in terms of your production or raw materials or whatever it is. Again, as I keep repeating, theories were formed in specific time frames. No theory is perfect. Do not try and look at a theory of a specific time frame from a larger understanding of the world today. Classical theory, trade theory postulates that the condition of perfectly competitive market, free trade between two nations, stimulate economic growth by way of generating a host of efficiency enhancing dynamic gains. That is why it was called classical theory, because classical, it looked at the fact that when a trade is happening, but we know it is not as simple as supply and demand. There are many other factors. So typically, if you look at a transaction between, let's say, you and, let's say, a vegetable vendor, now it's an unequal relationship. It is never an equal relationship, and that is one of the reasons why a lot of us negotiate with a vegetable vendor in terms of the vegetable prices, because it's an unequal relationship. Similarly, when you go to a five-star hotel, it is an unequal relationship. You do not negotiate. You go to a big brand, you do not negotiate. But when you are dealing with a vendor on a roadside, it's an unequal relationship. However, it may not be a panacea for economic problems of a developing economy. Trade related development outcomes are significantly dependent on a lot of factors. So nothing is straightforward. So initially, classical theory of the dynamics of trade and supply demand, there are nuances of trade. nature of commodities traded, terms of trade, value of currency. So today, for example, if you look at the value, the a US dollar is almost 86 to 87 rupees. There is an unequal value of currency in terms of the trade. And what is being traded? The model of export-led growth followed by most developing countries, standard example of development on some of the key segment. Now, this was also a policy prescription which happened in the 80s and the 90s, export-led growth, because more often than not, as a theory, it was posited by a lot of Western economists in terms of export-led growth. And again, as I said, as we go through this PPT, we'll see the nuances in this particular theory. Trade-based development paradigms, significant implications for workers, nature of employment, earning levels, wage inequality, because besides issues related with acquisition of skills, etc. by workers. It's not such a straightforward deal. What is the kind of trade it's happening? What are the items being traded? What are the terms? What are the currencies? Then in terms of that, how does it impact workers? There is an increase in demand for products of various industries. So essentially, this was the policy prescription that with increase of trade, there will be an increase of demand for products, leads to emergence of new employment opportunities. Nobody looked at the fact what were these employment opportunities, what kind of skills are required, how does employment opportunities change, how does wage inequalities change, what will happen in terms of skilling, what will happen in terms of labor laws. Remain eager to reduce costs. In the process, they attempt to offer part-time, informal, contractual in terms of employment relation. Then things like feminization of workforce, because women, as I showed you in the last unit, are receive less wages. They are supposed to be more docile. They can be pushed. One of the reasons why a lot of textile manufacturing in South Asia is women led, because they can push the wages down. So there is a theoretical link to relation between foreign trade and income inequalities. There is a Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Again, as I said, you don't need to remember these names. You could typically, crafting an answer, you say there is a theoretical link between foreign trade and income inequalities. Increase of trade in developing countries with developed world, reduction in wage inequality in developing, and increase in wage inequality in developed. So that's what the theorem is. Now, again, you need to understand, is it still applicable with the new modes of production, with the global commodity chains or production networks? Is the inequality the same? What is happening? In fact, the political thing in the US economy was about jobs because of outsourcing and global production networks. Most of the jobs were coming in the global south, and the politics of US and Europe is getting affected with this moving of jobs to the global south. In US, there has taken place widening of wage inequality between skilled and unskilled workers, as well as job loss. In Europe, wide incidence of job loss, rising unemployment, equated with more trade. So you see, it has its consequences. Now, is it really better for the developing countries or the global south? We will see that it is not as simple as that. There are nuances to that too. So developing countries well endowed with low skilled labor, expansion of low skilled intensive sector, increased demand for low skilled worker. This demand leads to an increase in wages uh, of skilled versus unskilled. Now, again, maybe this sentence is wrong. Actually, uh, because there is unskilled people and there is a demand for unskilled people, and the supply is equally there, more often than not, the wages remain the same, but the skilled people, the demand is less, and their salaries typically stay put. So one of the factors they say is the fact that the wage inequality is reduced, but actually we see that is also not the case. Because of informalization, they are able to push wages, leading to again inequality in wages in the developing countries also. In reality, there remains a large absence of full employment. So, and look at the fact, if trade requires technology to come in for that production, that technology would require a higher skilled worker, and less skilled worker often gets substituted. So you see, in spite of the fact, on one level, it says that the income inequality decreases in an underdevelopment country. In the actual working, there is it actually increases. Polarization of employment in labor market, which affects the distribution pattern of income. So in the same sentences, there is a contradiction. So at one level, uh, there is an argument which says that, oh, trade will increase employment, but then to improve productions or to increase productions so that they are able to produce more, they require technology. Technology requires skill. You have an abundance of unskilled worker, and inevitably those unskilled worker then gets left out to be taken by skilled, and there is an income inequality which increases. Job polarization upshot of technology changes. Middle skilled workers often get replaced through machine. So it's not as simple as that. Production, you outsource the production, that will lead to more employment, and it will lead to a reduction of inequalities, inequalities. So you see, within these three slides, there is a contradiction. So when you are crafting an answer in terms of trade, you can easily write that trade essentially in the classical sense may look at increase of job opportunities, because production is coming in the developing countries. In the classical sense, it might appear that there is more employment and the inequalities between less skilled and more skilled reduce. But in the real sense, because of the way the capitalist system works in terms of higher production and more profits, middle skilled people get substituted by machines. They need higher skilled people, which low skill then get laid off, and inequalities then increase. Guys, am I making sense? Guys, am I able to make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. So techniques of production and employment also are varied, like labor absorbing technology, labor augmenting technology, labor displacing technology. So technology is also not so simple. In fact, many a times when there is a push or a narrative of technology, actually a technology in many a cases is not able to absorb or augment but displace labor. So labor absorbing facilitates not only employment of more workers in the production process, provides simultaneously the scope for raising productivity of workflows. Then there is labor augmenting, increases the efficiency of labor. Labor displacing restricts the usage of labor in the production process. So typically, things like AI are actually labor displacing technologies.
Sir, excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
So,
Yes,
sir,
good.
any example of labor augmenting technology?
Gurpreet, a mobile phone is a labor augmenting technology.
Sir.
So today, for example, you need to go from point A to point B. You are able to see a map and go more efficiently. It's a labor augmenting technology. In
Right, sir.
fact, when we studied the Toyota model, that was a labor augmenting technology, whereby they did not say complete automation. They said automation, where the labor controls the automation. In fact, whenever you use technology which displaces labor, now a technology is failable. It is not never 100% sure. In fact, when you use technology to displace labor, there are more errors which come. Gurpreet?
Sir,
Yes, sir. Got it, please. Thank you.
sir,
Yes, yes, Sanjeev.
can we quote the example of online payments?
As what?
Labor augmenting technology?
It is a labor augmenting technology.
Yes. Yes, sir.
So, for example, see, also there is this major debate on fake news and social media. What most of the social media like Facebook, Twitter, and everything are doing, they are using labor displacing technology to figure out fake news or misinformation. Now, that is the reason why it does not work, because in a human communication, there are so many nuances to a communication. A technology cannot detect those nuances. So rather than use labor, they are making big claims of AI and this and that, and inevitably they are not able to catch. Sanjeev?
Sir.
Okay. So these are the three types of technologies, and inevitably nation or companies have to choose between the three to figure out what is best for them. Technology is considered synonymous with technical relative large amount of capital is used in production is called capital intensive. Inevitably, technology is capital intensive. Indispensable for accelerating the process of growth in developing nations. Now, again, you know, that's the larger narrative that inevitably it's only with technology that the growth will increase. So if a developing country gets stuck that we need only the technology for development, more often than not, then you will forget the power of the human being. Because one of the oldest saying is it's not the technology, but the person. Because at the end of the day, the technology is used by the human being. So if you get in a technology and you do not have human beings with proper skills to use the technology, you again are not able to derive benefits which a technology will give you. There is another form of technology called labor intensive technology. Large usage of labor vis-a-vis given quality of capital in production process. Uses of some same amount of capital with the application of greater amount of labor in the product. What Toyota is doing. Toyota is doing, it is not automation, but automation, where the labor is there, they use automation, but they are not dispensing with labor. Contributions to capital formation as well as raises the skill level of the workforce. Hello. Okay. In the framework of the labor and product market, in the short run, technological changes often remain high skill based. So you need to understand that if you are getting technology, inevitably it you need skills, and that's where the problem is. You are pushing the technology narration, and your workforce does not have the skills. You can look at it in terms of a company, or you can look at it in the form of a nation. So inevitably, even when a nation talks about economic growth or economic development and is taking the technology route, then unless you are training your workforce and improving their skills, it will come to naught. We have seen those examples so many times. Now, technology also, and we have seen in MDI 8 in terms of the production processes, how the production processes are changing. And inevitably, with technology coming in, there is a problem in terms of an institution of trade unions. Uh, I still remember the time when the Indian Railways was trying to introduce computers. There was heavy resistance from the trade union because they felt that the computers are going to take the jobs away. The interesting part of technology change at that time was, even though the computerization took some jobs away, actually a new set of jobs got created with computerization. So you also need to understand that technology reorients jobs, but now you need more skills for doing that job. So, for example, there have been questions of AI in this class many times. Remember, with AI, there will be other types of jobs. Some of those jobs may be high skilled in terms of programming, but a large part of those jobs will be extremely low skill in terms of data entry. Technology is needed for an industry to remain competitive. In most of workers in such situations lose their job, many lose their skills, and otherwise lose both. Sometimes it's possible to retrain and retain the workflows. So inevitably, whenever a company or a nation is looking to change production process or looking to bring in new technology, one has to think through in terms of all aspect of the change. Because if you are not thinking through of all aspects of the change, then there is going to be a total chaos. Say, for example, what is happening in terms of the international trade. When the Trump administration did not think about all aspects of the trade tariffs, look at the confusion it has caused in the global share market. I was seeing this video about how the bond markets and how the bond market vigilantes actually got the Trump administration to put a pause on their tariffs. And now there is a pressure to remove the tariffs of the China trade also, because we have already reached a position of globalization, supply chains. Things are in such a way that it is impossible to go back. There has been reduction in tenured employment, worsening contractual condition, retrenchment of workers. Owing to this, there is general resistance of trade unions to the introduction of new technology. Now it's a different matter because of global supply chains and the global production process. The whole concept of trade unions themselves are under pressure. The trade unions, in fact, desperately waned in terms of power. They seem to be coming back slowly. However, there is this change of production processes which are happening. Introduction of trade liberalization under broad structural adjustment program. For example, the Indian economy since 90, what we were seeing is the broad structural adjustment program, easing of trade reductions that attracted multinational companies to invest and establish industries. What they say is the liberalized regime. It also exposed Indian firms with greater competition. These firms had to introduce technology, shun extra manpower, weaken trade unions. So there are changes which are happening at various levels. Foreign trade influences technology change in various levels. Domestic firms to innovate, technology diffusion through transmission. In fact, as we go through the presentation, many a times you might get confused with alternate statements. Understand the fact that these are alternate perspectives. So there is one perspective which says that trade is good, and yet we need to understand that it is not as straightforward good as it is nuanced. So when you are crafting an answer, you can write those nuances. You could say that classical view talks about trade being good because trade looks at production, increase of production facilities. However, the increase of production facilities or transfer of technology can lead to unskilled people getting laid off, or the production process getting changed due to increase of informalization, casualization or contractualization, which could lead to loss of permanent employment, which could lead to insecurity. So you need to craft an answer. Direct access to better technology, import of intermediate and capital goods, lead to reallocation of market shares in favor of more productive firms, encourage them to adopt skill-based new technologies. So, in fact, one of the reasons given for opening of the Indian market was the fact that Indian companies need to compete with the global to get best product. But we have seen the consequence has been the flooding of the Indian market with cheaper Chinese products. In fact, a whole lot of Indian manufacturing shrunk, because now importer could directly import cheap products which were much costlier to manufacture in the country. So it led to both ways. And then we are also seeing the rise of crony capitalists, where there is a certain protection given to them. So all kinds of things are happening together. In developing countries context, technology changes generally the imported ones linked to foreign trade or foreign direct investment, FDI, may enjoy late cover benefit by not following the inefficient technology option, rather may leapfrog directly to better and efficient. So that is also true. When you come in late, you can, for example, India leapfrog directly into the service sector rather than going through the agriculture industry services. So there is, it's a very difficult call as to when you should. So if you see, you decide to buy a mobile phone today and you see various models, you wait for 3 months, you get a better phone at a cheaper price. Now it's a call that you take whether to buy today or to wait 3 months. And what will happen in 3 months in terms of opportunity cost? Then there is a concept of technology spillovers through imports and FDI inflows. New technologies are absorbed through various channels. Developing countries may attain technology catch up. What typically China did was a lot of technology spillovers and catch up. In fact, today China is at par with the US in terms of cutting edge technologies like AI, robotics, because in fact, they went through a process where a lot of Chinese who worked and trained and learned in the US came back, set up their own companies. The Chinese government gave them opportunities to do that, and India kind of missed that bus in a way. It's not that it's not happening out here, but obviously, today in China and US are on par at the cutting edge. Because technology transfer also requires training, expertise, new softwares, may improve production, reduce cost, improve quality, lessen environment. That this transfer technology to developing world is generally horizontal rather than vertical. So there is a technology which gets developed out there and gets transferred. That's why it's called horizontal. Whereas vertical is it keeps on evolving. So technology, remember, technology also keeps on evolving. You have a particular technology, it has to keep evolving to a better technology. And that leads to building of capabilities and competitiveness. In fact, one of the reasons cited for India lagging behind was not enough research and development into engineering and technology. Because we went into that export-led growth, it was easier to get foreign direct investment. Not enough resources or focus was developed into developing R&D, which typically now we've got stuck in terms of horizontal transfer. Horizontal transfer always has a disadvantage that you're dependent on somebody else. In situation when progressive development technology is desired from research to development to production. What India was able to do well was the pharma sector, where there was a lot of R&D which was done. Manufacturing sector, for example, is composed of both organized and unorganized sector. Unorganized is micro and small enterprise, whereas former contain large scale unit. Now, 90s Indian economy adopted the trade liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And also with the presence of so many complicated laws, more often than not, a lot of companies try to remain in the small and medium sector to escape the various laws rather than scale up. Increased flow of inputs, entry of numerous foreign entities, market competition forced domestic firms to enhance productivity, capital intensive skill-based technology, which what we typically define as jobless growth. So there's a growth of GDP, but there are not enough jobs being created. And inevitably, as we said, unless a country devotes enough of resources and money to education, to R&D, to skill development, to higher education, the whole concept of technology enhancement, manufacturing will not work out because you need constant upgradations. Then, of course, there are changing patterns of employment, changes patterns of production, led to expansion of labor-intensive export orient. And then, when the export sector, the focus started coming on the export sector, then the production was led by the export sector. What is demanded outside? Now, typically, the problem with too much of dependence on export sector is what we are seeing today. If US starts imposing tariffs on our exports, we become uncompetitive. Even though, and so that is why you need to have a proper sectoral allocation. You cannot depend on any one sector because global situations change. And today, with enhancement of globalization and information communication technology, any event or any change at any one place in the world affects everybody. Capital intensive and skill based production process, large proportion of women workers had to lose employment due to low skill levels. So again, you so how is it working? So production processes are coming, but to increase profitability you bring in technology. Technology requires skills. Those skills get thrown out, and and then money gets concentrated in the few hands, whereas a large majority are left to fend for themselves. Foreign trade influenced significantly the composition of employment. Large informalization of workforce, share of contract versus regular versus increased significantly. In fact, one of the things that we will see in MDI 8 was that the Indian trade unions kept opposing contractor basis or informalization rather than go in for improving work conditions for these workers. So, because the trade union kept opposing contract basis or informal work, what typically happened? The whole, power of the trade unions kept on decreasing, and the contract and the informalization kept on increasing. So, if they would have actually pushed for better conditions for contract and informal workers, possibly the Indian labor or the Indian worker might have been better off. So let's look at the World Trade Organization, WTO, and labor related issues. Also understand from the theory of unequal relationship, unequal exchange, and the structuralism that we studied earlier. We looked at the fact, and all these theories talked about a core and periphery. And we also looked at the fact from the imperial model and the dependency theory that the core always tries to push the periphery in an unequal exchange. Now, all these WTOs, GATS, and all these things was looking at the global north trying to have an unfair advantage from the global south. In fact, World Bank, Monetary Fund, all their policy prescription were actually, which were adopted by the third world, actually went against the third world. WTO has been instrumental in strengthening the market economy, free trade across the world, but it does not regulate labor standards. So it says we want free trade. Each nation should take care of its own labor standards. It plays a role in labor-related issues through intersection of trade policy and labor rights, but it has no power to implement labor rights, which it allows the countries to do. So if there is a short question on WTO or GATT related, you could typically write about focuses on trade liberalization, reducing tariffs, eliminating non-trade barriers, and look at the fact, WTO and GATT actually were talking about, and over the years, this free trade regime, for example, in the European Union, there is a free trade agreement between whatever that 18 countries or what. Then there was this NAFTA. In Asian countries. There are some agreements, there are some bilateral agreements. And then in the 21st century, at this time and age, that the Trump administration comes and puts tariffs. So reverses everything that has been achieved by the world in trying to reduce tariffs. However, these goals can sometimes conflict with the protection of workers' rights and labor standards, because inevitably the capitalist wants to make profit. It's the duty of the welfare state to protect the workers' rights and labor standards. Lower trade barriers have increased competitiveness, raised to the bottom practices. Countries with weak labor laws attract businesses, resulting in poor conditions. So, Sophia, what you talked about Romania and construction possibly is because of that weak labor laws. Whoever is able to get cheap labor to construct infrastructure gets away with it, and exploitation of workers. So we are almost coming back in a cyclic way to the time when industrial revolution happened, when there were no workers' rights. Others argue that increased trade can lead to higher standards of living, improved working conditions. Trade openness is seen to promoting economic growth, job creation, and spread of active practices. As I keep telling you, many a times during the PPT, as well as when you read the unit, you will see there are conflicting statements. Remember, these are perspectives. These are narrative perspectives. WTO and labor-related issues. ILO sets conventions of variety of workers' rights. WTO does not mandate compliance. Growing recognition of the need for coordination between trade policy and labor standards should reflect minimum labor standards to ensure trade does not lead to exploitation. However, we see that trade does relate to exploitation because of informalization of economy. Developing countries, on the contrary, argue that linking trade to labor standard is a form of economic imperialism. So remember, developing countries are also running to try and the politicians or the politics of the country tries to show that we have given jobs, we have created jobs, we have increased growth. That's why in the Indian media, for example, you keep talking about India's GDP, so and so, essentially trying to bring out a narrative that GDP is linked to so many jobs being created, so many things being created, and a trickle down approach. They claim that wealthy nations might use these standards to block products from poorer nations. Same high level of labor protection due to economic constraint. One of the reasons why we had seen why the global north pushes production in global south, because if they were to do the same production in global north because of their labor standards, etc., and laws, it is costly to produce things out there. In the global south, they don't care about laws, they don't care about practices. They want their product of their standard at the lowest cost. Growing concern, role of global supply chains in perpetuating poor labor conditions in low-wage countries. We have already seen that in MDI 8 when we are talking about global supply chain, outsource production to countries with weak labor laws to reduce costs, worker exploitation. WTO does not directly regulate labor conditions. Then they have brought in a new concept of corporate social responsibility, consumer pressure, holding companies accountable. But unless the consumers are aware about what is going on, one does not know, and so on and so forth. The term they use are sweatshops, where workers are exploited to produce goods. So let's sum up. Earlier notions of foreign trade were principle of comparative advantage by Ricardo. Remember, Ricardo was also who put the theory of classical economics of surpluses. Foreign trade is not always a panacea for all economic problems of a developing economy. Also understand, as we have been seeing through various units, as we have studied various units of MDI 7 and 8, no particular policy prescription, whether they come from the West or they are homegrown, is perfect. nations, companies, individuals have to balance out between various policy prescriptions. It is like, when you are looking at your finances, you do not rush to, procure only one thing. You always hedge it up. So, but for a nation or a company, it becomes that much bigger because, there is growth, there is development of people, there is employment, there is export, there is trade. All kinds of things need to be figured out, and money allocated and focus given. So there are some references in both the thing. You can through it. Let me stop here. Let me switch on the video. Any questions? Hi guys. I hope I was able to give you the larger sense of the unit in terms of how these things function. Again, as I said, more often than not, you need to craft an answer in your question whenever you have a question in your question paper to be able to write an answer and clear your examination. Any particular question? I hope I didn't go too fast. Vinod, I hope I didn't go too fast. Sanjeev, Sophia, Domingos, I hope I didn't go too fast.
Sir, I joined in the middle actually.
Okay. If you want the PPT, you can just send me a
Yes,
mail.
yes, sir.
Anyway, it will be there on the YouTube channel, so you can go through it.
Sir.
Domingos, I hope I didn't go too fast.
Yes, sir. I don't have any question.
I hope I didn't go too fast. Were you able to follow?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it was
Great.
interesting, sir.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Shreya? I don't have any question today.
Okay. Shreya, Gurpreet. Sophia?
No questions, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So again, as I said, in case you want the PPT, can cut mass of job. Inevitably, Shreya, it again depends on technology. So some technologies can cut off a particular job and bring out job in another area. There might be some technologies which may cut off large part of jobs because it might require a higher level of skilling, which is not there. It again depends on technology. It depends on the production process. It depends on many factors. It's not a straightforward thing. It's not a straightforward thing that if you okay, let me give you an example. It's not a straightforward thing that uh, just because you are in a class and we are talking economics, you will understand everything about economics. There will be so many factors. It might be a factor that you might be ill. There might be a factor that we might have a technology problem in trying to hear what I'm trying to say. It might be a factor that you might you might be thinking about something else. So there are so many factors in a particular way things are done, and one has to look at the nuances of it. But inevitably, one thing is there: if a new technology comes, the workers either need to be skilled, and if they are not skilled, unskilled workers will lose their job, or they need to be new workers need to be hired. So there are multiple permutation combinations, and unless you are able to think through and see the multiple permutation combination, just getting a technology does not lead to anything. In fact, it can disrupt the whole process, like what we have seen. But if they are skilled, sir, it's not generate the same quality of jobs as it is lost. Absolutely. So a new technology might, if they are skilled but they are not skilled. Okay, let's look at the fact that you have a graphic designer now with an AI app. like Canva, which does graphic designing, unless the graphic designer who does on pen and paper knows how to use a computer and Canva and the app, nobody would need his job. Now the company would say we can use the Canva on our own self. We do not need you. Shreya? So you see,
Yes, sir.
that way a person can lose a job.
That's why I said that, sir, not not generate as much jobs as it gets lost. Right. That's
Shreya,
why
I'm
I
not able
said.
to understand you very well. Your voice is coming muffled.
Sir, as I'm in
Acha, you're
office,
sitting
that's
somewhere.
why.
Why don't you just type
Yes,
it?
sir.
Why don't you just type
Okay,
it?
sir. Okay. Okay.
So I think what Shreya was talking about is the same thing, that technology can cut some jobs which can't be regenerated. I think she's typing something. So that is why, many a times the political rhetoric and the actual real life situations are marked different, because in the real world there are many factors at play and one needs to understand. So when a company decides to change a process or bring in a new technology, it has to plan out and see how this technology will disrupt employment. Do they need then permanent? That is why I said it is compensatable. Yes, of course, absolutely, Shreya, you're absolutely right. So typically technology can bring in a new set of jobs, or it needs a certain a new set of skills which are required, and it can lead to disruptions. Absolutely, every technology leads to a disruption, and that is why innovations, technologies, these are all disruptors. Unless there's a better production process or a better technology, obviously then you will have to look at the employment, you have to look at the labor, you have to look at the skilling levels, and then you have to look at the fact that if you're not able to provide those employment, it could lead to political instability, it could lead to mass migration, and so on and so forth. Okay. So in case you want the PPT, you can email me. Otherwise, all the best for your next classes. I will see you tomorrow at 12:30 with MDI 8. Bye then.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, guys.